Just a couple quick points of business before we go. This is a strange time for us in a compressed fall quarter. So there are a number of you, there are a number of people that are going to be coming in like a little bit into the lecture. There's a number that have to go before the lecture. There's an even greater number than that, as we can see, who are not going to be here. But just do know, if and when you talk to anyone in the department, the talk is being recorded, so it will be available to anyone who's not here, and I will announce that again over email. Come on in, Danny. So, welcome. I'm delighted today to welcome Christopher Fan to us. This is a weird day. It's a difficult and weird day, and I imagine a very hard one to sit down and to kind of bear down and to really concentrate on a talk, and how much harder to actually have to deliver a talk. I talked to one person in our department who just said that they had to go home and nap because they were so depressed. So this is, we'll kind of muddle through this together, but we are really, really lucky to have Christopher with us. Christopher is right now a University of California Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Riverside. He is also, at the same time, the co-founder and right now still the senior editor of Hyphen magazine, which, I would encourage all of you to go look at Hyphen, because this kind of stuff often gets dropped during an introduction and gets pushed to the side. But it's an extraordinary publication, a widely read one, and an expertly done one. So it's worth looking at. Christopher received his BA from Cornell University, summa cum laude. He received his master's at New York University in the program for humanities and social thought, and he received his PhD earlier this year from University of California, Berkeley in the Department of English. He is the author of multiple published articles, some of them, one forthcoming in the Journal of Asian American Studies, one already out in the Journal of Transnational American Studies, one already out in Post 45. He's published regularly and widely in non-academic journals as well, not just Hyphen, but also the New Inquiry. And he is, as most of us now know, completing, or at least at different stages of work, in two different projects. So I'm not going to describe those projects because I know Christopher will speak to at least one of them in depth over the course of the talk. The second project is China and the Global Imagination, and some of the published essays that you've seen in Christopher's files are from that. His files are from that book, or that book project. It's the first one, though, that Christopher will be speaking to us today from, and that is, I think, that's the title of the book project itself?
Almost. The second part after the book.
Okay, so that's the book project that he's working on now. It's a fascinating project that takes up the kind of ramifications of the 1965 Immigration Act in relationship to an emerging set of discourses over Asian American activism and what the Asian American would mean at the same moment in time. And it kind of reads tensions between those two and through C.P. Snow and much else besides. With that, I will simply give it over to Christopher. We'll have a Q&A obviously afterwards, but please join me in welcoming Chris.
Thanks, Michael, for that introduction. Yeah, so it is a really awkward and unfortunate day to be giving a job talk and be thinking about futurities and to be investing in them. But I think that we nonetheless should. And I did want to say just one thing, sort of about our collective experience over the past 24 hours before it began. So I can't imagine a more distracting context or set of circumstances in which to give a talk. And as many of you have, I've experienced many emotions over the past 24 hours, and I'm not sure which of them is going to stick and which of them is going to end up inhabiting me. But at the risk of sounding quaint, I just wanted to say that I really believe that the work we do in English departments and in the humanities in general is even more crucial in times like these. But this is not new. The situation we're in is not new. and our work in the humanities shows us how history moves through us, how we move through history, and how we're capable of moving history ourselves. This is not new. So those who appeared to peddle the kind of nostalgia over the past year were actually, in my view, peddling a kind of forgetting. In the humanities, we don't forget. And we hold ourselves accountable even when we find ourselves on the side of forgetting. And in essence, that's what my talk is about today, or at least that's the meaning that I found in my talk over the past 24 hours, as I've been trying to focus on it. And to tell you the truth, I had to avert my gaze last night and turn on The Walking Dead because it seemed to present a more pleasant world that was emerging. But my talk today is about how we sometimes need to do a better job of remembering stories about ourselves that we'd rather forget. And so for the next 45 minutes or so, I invite you to think with me, and then in the conversation afterwards, I look forward to thinking together with you. All right. So my talk today is drawn from the first chapter of my current book project. Actually, sorry, before I begin, everybody has a handout. There's a Okay, so my talk today is drawn from the first chapter of my current book project, Principles of Selection, Asian American Fiction After 1965. Before I dive in, I just want to take a few minutes to lay out the main arguments and concerns of the book and then situate the talk within it. So the central argument of Principles of Selection is that Asian American literary criticism has overlooked a major shift in the demographic constitution of Asian America from a population defined by exclusion policies dating back to the 19th century to a population that over the past 50 years has been increasingly defined by selection, a term that I use to refer not just to immigration selection policies, but also to the model minoritization of Asian Americans. And what I mean by model minoritization very generally is the orientation, the endemic orientation, the self-orientation of Asian Americans towards assimilation and economic security rather than resistant politics. The consequence of this oversight for Asian American literary and cultural criticism has been an overemphasis on theories and reading practices that seek to recover and advocate an anti-racist, anti-Orientalist resistant politics, what I call the exclusion thesis that lies at the foundation of Asian American studies, and that has contributed to a logic of mutual exclusivity that ignores or disavows narratives of selection. Rather than totally refute the exclusion thesis, which I don't disagree with at all, even more so today, the goal of Principles of Selection is to resist the logic of mutual exclusivity that this thesis bestows and to restore proportionality to the narratives of selection that the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act helped to catalyze and proliferate. So the payoff of this intervention is that it puts Asian American literary studies on a footing to be able to engage productively with certain post-1965 material realities. And one of these is the occupational segregation of Asian Americans into techno-scientific fields and the model minoritization that has attended that process. Another one of these realities is the explosion of paraliterary genre production after 1990, mostly in the fields of science fiction, fantasy, and young adult fiction, which together constitute the most vibrant area of Asian American literary production today. So a concomitant of the overemphasis on exclusion has been an overprivileging of literary fiction in the development of Asian American theory, which means that for the past quarter century or so, we've been generating Asian American theory based on what I see as a small number of what are now non-representative texts. So that said, it's precisely because of the overprivileging of literary fiction that Principle of Selection's first chapter reassesses critical engagements with two of the best-known works of literary fiction in the Asian American canon, Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior and Cheng Rei Li's Native Speaker. So my talk today is drawn from this chapter. And although I won't be talking about the book's other chapters on science fiction and Silicon Valley fiction today, my hope is that this talk will demonstrate how a selection framework can establish continuities between post-1965 Asian American science fiction and literary fiction. Not because of any shared genre conventions, but because of a shared sense of how the post-1965 Asian American identity is ultimately a post-racial identity, determined primarily by material forces of immigration and political economy, rather than anything that can be derived from essentialisms like biology or traditional culture. So I take up this argument in more detail in my chapter on Ted Chiang, and I'd of course be happy to answer any questions about it during Q&A. So just one last very quick note before I dive in. So I used the phrase resistant politics several times throughout the talk, and I just want to clarify that I'm using it as a shorthand. It sounds very vague, but I'm using it as a shorthand for the politics that emerged out of the Asian American student movements of the late 1960s and that gave birth to Asian America as a pan-ethnic political identity, as well as the very first ethnic studies and Asian American studies programs. So to the extent that we can generalize about these politics, I think it's safe to say that they're committed to a resistant politics consisting at minimum of anti-discrimination and anti-imperialism, as well to imagining spaces of play that transcend such limitations. So that's what I mean by that. So there are perhaps no more preeminent texts in the Asian American literary canon than Maxine Hong Kingston's 1976 novel, The Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts, and Chiang Rae-Lee's 1995 novel, Native Speaker. Readings of these texts, moreover, have been crucial to the intellectual and institutional development of Asian American studies. Kingston's text, in particular, has enjoyed a wide readership outside of Asian American studies, especially in the fields of feminist criticism and autobiography studies. According to several accounts, Woman Warrior was, at least at one point in the late 1990s, the most widely read and taught text in US colleges and universities that was by a living American author. In regard to the development of Asian American theory and politics, feminist criticism of Woman Warrior in the 1980s and 1990s almost single-handedly lifted Asian American studies out of the grip of the cultural nationalist discourse over authenticity into a post-structuralist phase that continues to define the field. Native Speaker, meanwhile, is among the most prominent and widely studied novels to have come out of the initial explosion of Asian American literary and cultural production that took place beginning in the mid-80s, but especially in the 1990s. The year 1991 has often been singled out as an annus mirabilis because of the number of Asian American novels published that year, including titles such as Gish Jen's A Typical American and Amy Tan's second novel, The Kitchen God's Wife, but also because of the awarding of the American Book Award to Karen Te Yamashita for her novel Through the Arc of the Rainforest. More recently, one critic observed that, quote, if 1991 was indeed a year of miracles, what makes it doubly miraculous is how its accomplishments have been dwarfed by the productivity and success of the decades that followed. So one of the goals of my talk today and of the book project Principles of Selection more broadly is to generate a description of this period's conditions of emergence, which coalesced out of the tremendous demographic transformations instigated by the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act. At the same time, my pursuit of this goal is inseparable from a demonstration of how the signifier Asian America has continued to evolve as a set of formal conventions, even if its relationship to its putative empirical referent has become ever more complicated in the post-1965 period. So my talk today will be in three sections. In the first, I'll flesh out the historical context of the shift from exclusion to selection and make a case for why C.P. Snow's trope of the two cultures conflict between the arts and the sciences offers a powerful analytic for reading the dialectic between exclusion and selection in post-1965 Asian American fiction. In the second section, I'll generate a metacritical critique of Xiaoling Wang's exemplary and influential reading of Woman Warrior that privileges exclusion at the expense of selection. In my final section, I'll take a similar metacritical approach to Native Speaker and at one particularly vexing reading by Walter Ben Michaels that privileges selection at the expense of exclusion. So as I mentioned, it's been widely observed that Asian American studies has been rooted in a narrative of exclusion in which Asian American identity is predominantly defined by experiences of oppression. To offer a taste of what privileging exclusion at the expense of selection looks like, here are two passages from two foundational texts of Asian American criticism. The first is from Xiaoling Wang, who argues in her 1993 book, Reading Asian American Literature from Necessity to Extravagance, which I'll be engaging with extensively in this talk. This is the first quote in your handout. From a legal perspective, the peoples previously known as Orientals and now designated as Asian Americans have almost all, at one time or another, been excluded from US citizenship. Recent refugees and immigrants from Southeast Asia in the wake of the Vietnam War constitute an exception. So just what I want you to notice in this quote is how the picture of Asian American is sort of the subaltern picture that Asian America is defined by these histories of exclusion, and when we get even proximal to something like a history of selection, it has to do with refugees. And so things like the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which are exemplary of these policies of selection, are not referenced here. So the second example of a foundational point of departure for Asian American studies is from Lisa Lowe. In her 1996 book, Immigrant Acts, she offers a modification of the exclusion thesis that overemphasizes the proletarianization of Asian America. So after 1965, she argues, quote, the profile of Asian immigration has consisted of low-wage service sector workers, unquote. So this, however, is simply false. Since 1965, Asian immigration has in fact increasingly consisted of high-wage, high-skilled workers. So the juridical dimension of the exclusion narrative is bookended, that's referenced in this quote by Wong, is bookended by the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act on one end, and hopefully the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act on the other. The intervening years saw the passage of legislation like the Asiatic Barred Zone, a long list of state alien land laws preventing Asian Americans from legally owning land, and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. This period of exclusion putatively ended with the passage of the 1965 Act, which eliminated the last remaining vestiges of racist immigration policies and nation-based quotas that were undermining America's Cold War persona of moral superiority. The shift from exclusion to selection began on or about October 3rd, 1965, with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And the act didn't go into effect until 1968, but when it did, there was an almost overnight explosion of Asian immigration. So this is the chart that's on the back of your page. This is from the Migration Policy Institute in 2013, using 2013 data, but this is immigration from Asia after 1960, and I think the shape of the graph speaks for itself. This, by the way, just to quantify it, represents a 26-fold increase in immigration from Asia. While there had been prior to 1965 a long history of policies and special dispensations that allowed for the highly selective immigration of Asian intellectuals, students, and diplomats, the 1965 Act consolidated occupational selection policies around the Department of Labor's Schedule A, which was a list of jobs for which qualified U.S. workers were difficult to find, and it continues to be this list, but it was very specifically trained on professions in scientific and technical fields in 1965. But this is just to say that 1965 is not the only immigration selection policy that went into the shaping of Asian America, but it was the most prominent. There's a history of selection that precedes that, but it was very minuscule compared to what the 1965 Act unleashed. Okay, so there's also a complicated history to how these selection policies have evolved since 1965. For instance, legislators have variously put the brakes on and accelerated immigration based on these professional selection policies. But it wouldn't be an understatement to say that the effect of these policies on the composition of post-1965 Asian America has been profound. In 1964, Asian immigrants comprised only 14% of technical and scientific students and professionals arriving in the US. In 1970, that percentage rose to 62. Subsequent modifications of the 1965 Act and its policies have only increased the proportion of new Asian immigrants in technical professions. The Act also established the H-1B visa for highly specialized, predominantly technical workers who have been the sine qua non of the American technology and R&D sectors. Revisions to the program have further skewed preferences even more in favor of those with technical backgrounds. So in 2012, for instance, 76.5% of H-1B visas were granted for computer-related professions, and roughly that same percentage of workers were drawn from India and East Asia. So this is what's happened to Asian immigration since 1965. In regard to Asian Americans, a recent Pew Research Center study shows that Asian Americans have entered techno-scientific fields at nearly 3 times the rate of the general population, resulting in the highest rates of what sociologists call occupational segregation of any ethnic group in the US. The 1965 Act thus reinflected the longstanding stereotype of Asian Americans as model minorities, which portrays Asian Americans as hardworking, law-abiding, politically quietist, and economically secure. After 1965, this stereotype has been strongly inflected with the assimilationist features of economic, professional, and academic success, in addition to techno-scientific professional specificity. As Madeline Hsu argues in her recent book, The Good Immigrants, which is one of the few monographs available about Asian America and immigration selection, the production of Asian America as an occupationally segregated model minority population has helped to naturalize the neoliberal principles behind the policies that produce these trends. So forms of the model minority certainly predate 1965. For instance, as Colleen Lai has argued, one of the most persistent features of the model minority has been a trope of economic efficiency that extends back into the 19th century when Chinese coolie laborers were being selected for a very different set of labor skills. And so what I'm trying to illustrate with that fact is how it's only after 1965 that the stereotype of the model minority becomes associated with academic and professional success in technoscientific fields. So the 1965 Act thus gave birth to what is one of the most predominant racial forms of contemporary Asian America, the math and science nerd. In order to distinguish these more recent forms of the model minority, the nerds from the pre-1965 forms, I make recourse to the British scientist cum novelist C.P. Snow's description of the two cultures conflict between the arts and sciences. So I want to take a moment to reconstruct his argument because its aptness as a description of post-1965 Asian America, I think, can be seen in how it responds to the same Cold War tensions that the 1965 Act sought to address, and also in how it produces many of the same racial forms. In his 1959 lecture, The Two Cultures in the Scientific Revolution, Snow argued that the arts, mainly literary, and scientific culture, those are his phrases, literary and scientific culture, represented two essentially different modes of thought and temperament, and that understanding between the two camps was mostly non-existent. For Snow, the two cultures conflict was an allegory for US-Soviet conflict. His famous advocacy for a scientific emphasis in Western education was rooted in his belief that a scientific revolution could end the Cold War by bringing the two powers together to solve social problems such as poverty. In the second part of his lecture, he expands on this argument by granting China a special role as the vanguard of this scientific revolution. Impressed by China's post-war industrialization, and this is 1959, so this is several years before the Great Leap Forward and the tragedy that unleashed. So impressed by China's post-war industrialization, Snow argues that China offers a model of development for other poor countries. He prescribes the following for the West. Quote number 2. An educational program as complete as the Chinese, who appear in 10 years to have transformed their universities and built so many new ones that they are now nearly independent of scientists and engineers from outside. 10 years, with scientific teachers from this country and the US, and what is also necessary with teachers of English, other poor countries could do the same in 20. So in true model minority fashion, China accomplishes in 10 years what other countries could only hope to do in 20. Moreover, the other poor countries Snow refers to are African countries, as he specifies later. So insofar as Snow racializes China and Africa, according to these sort of developmental capabilities, his argument structurally mirrors the racial formation of the Asian American model minority, which is often figured as a buffer between black and white. But where Snow's account dovetails precisely with the racialization instituted by the 1965 Act, I want to argue, is in his characterization of China as a techno-scientific model minority. So one conclusion that we can draw from this is that depictions of artistic production and aesthetic value in post-1965 Asian American fiction, even in the absence of a scientific or technological foil, can be read as an evocation of the geopolitics and the political economy that constitute the 1965 Act's conditions of emergence. So if the two cultures conflict thus expresses something fundamental about post-1965 Asian American model minoritization, then it needs to be contrasted to the term Asian America itself, which was coined, again, during the radical student movements of the late 1960s that gave birth to ethnic studies programs. The legacy of these radical origins continues to be strong, despite the compromises demanded by the exigencies of institutional survival, and the field continues to be predominantly concerned with producing accounts of what Christopher Lee has called the idealized critical subject. This is slide number 3. Which he defines as a figure that is, quote, distinguished by its ability to reveal suppressed or neglected histories and experiences of domination, knowledge that in turn becomes the basis for political contestation and praxis, unquote. As a result of this rubric, the standard reading of Woman Warrior is that the text chronicles Maxine's struggle against Chinese patriarchy and American racism in order to fashion her own Chinese American feminist identity. And it's along these lines that Ed Chang, for example, reads Maxine's hypochondria as exemplary of racial melancholia's capacity for nationalist critique, and Kim Kok-chung reads the silence exhibited by various characters as what she calls a provocative silence that struggles against power while at the same time imagining alternative futures. The standard reading of native speaker's protagonist, Henry Park, is that his profession as a corporate spy symbolizes an unresolved internal racial dilemma between his Korean and American identities, and that the fraught pursuit of his assimilationist desire to be a native speaker reveals the psychically destructive force of whiteness as a norm. Now, it's along these lines that Tina Chen argues for Henry's critical capacity for impersonation, and Jody Kim reads Henry's assimilationist desire as a critique of the belated effects of the Cold War on the interdependency of racism and capitalism. So as different as these readings are from each other, they all extend from the same standard readings of each novel, which themselves extend from an exclusion thesis. So if even if Kingston's and Lee's characters exhibit desire for model minority status, the tendency of Asian American hermeneutics is to either transvalue that desire into resistant qualities or to pathologize it as an object lesson for a training in idealized critical subjecthood for its readers or for other Asian American scholars, or for anybody reading. I want to make clear again that I do not necessarily disagree with these kind of readings, which have been crucial not only to the institutional survival of Asian American studies, but also to the maintenance and nurturing of Asian American activism and cultural politics. Instead, I'm making a metacritical point about how one consequence of an oversupply of these readings is that it can tip the idealized critical subject over into transhistoricality and contradiction in such a way that resistant politics are undermined or outmoded. So another way to say this is that such a singular focus sacrifices the strategy of strategic essentialism to an urgent assertion of the transhistorical content of Asian American identity. That content being narratives of exclusion and the idealized critical subject. Okay, section 2. So by way of demonstrating how a post-1965 selection framework can correct for the overprivileging of exclusion, I want to turn now to Women Warrior, and in particular Salomon Wong's reading of the 2 sentences that conclude the chapter at the Western Palace. So to be sure, I focus on Wong not to cherry pick her as an example, but because her reading of At the Western Palace has been deeply influential on all subsequent readings of the novel, and more broadly on critical engagements with the themes of intergenerational conflict, model minoritization, and feminism. So my critique of her reading cross-applies to a great deal of subsequent and current Asian American scholarship. In the chapter At the Western Palace, Maxine's mother, Brave Orchid, brings her younger sister Moon Orchid to the US so that she can stage direct Moon Orchid's reunification with her estranged husband, who emigrated alone 30 years earlier, and in the meantime established a successful brain surgery practice in Los Angeles, as well as a second family with a much younger Chinese American wife. So Moon Orchid's drama of reunification ends badly. Her husband disavows her and their adult daughter, and Moon Orchid lives out the rest of her days in a mental asylum. So I offer this brief plot summary by way of equipping you to experience the strangeness of the chapter's closing pair of sentences, which Laura Hyun-Yi Kang, you see her friend's very own Laura Kang, calls cryptic, and Salomon Wong calls a non sequitur. Brave Orchid's daughters decided fiercely that they would never let men be unfaithful to them. All her children made up their minds to major in science or mathematics. So why would majoring in science or mathematics offer a solution, much less a response, to fears of adultery and abandonment? This is the question I'll show Wong unpacking that. I'll show how an overprivileging of exclusion creates certain contradictions. So Wong derives her framework for unpacking these sentences from an opposition between necessity and extravagance that's posed in the first chapter of Women Warrior, which is titled No Name Woman. The term necessity is used to describe Maxine's mother, Brave Orchid, who was a talented doctor in China, but is unable to attain certification to practice in the US, and so she instead devotes herself to her gendered roles as wife and mother. The term extravagance, on the other hand, refers to the adultery of the no-name woman. This is how the term extravagance is sort of narrated by Kingston, not by Wong. So extravagance refers to the adultery of the no-name woman who allegedly had a child out of wedlock, thus inciting her fellow villagers to ransack her family's home and ultimately drive her to suicide. So for Wong, this is her interpretation, necessity and extravagance. These two terms signify two contrasting modes of existence and operation. One contained, survival-driven, and conservation-minded, the other attracted to freedom, excess, emotional expressiveness, and autotelism. And just to give you a kind of preview where I'm going with this, there are a lot of correspondences that happen here. And so two cultures conflicts, as Wong's reading progresses, starts to correspond to these analogous pairs. So although Wong never makes reference to the two cultures conflict, it becomes clear in her deployments of the necessity-extravagance opposition that these two terms are analogous to the two cultures, with necessity on the side of sciences and extravagance on the side of arts. Moreover, Wong associates extravagance with idealized critical subjecthood and resistant Asian American politics. So the ultimate goal of Wong's study is to make a case for what she calls, very influentially, a textual coalition of Asian American literature that mediates both literary production and Asian American political identity. So this idea of textual coalition was one of the main instigators of Asian American studies post-structuralist turn in the 1990s. And it offered a solution to the problem of reproducing or basing Asian American archival choices and political identity on essentialist biological and traditional cultural categories. And so her solution is to offer a notion of intertextuality, which she calls this textual coalition that should be the basis for Asian American theory and literary criticism from that point on. So for Wong, extravagance is the proper basis for this coalition and everything that corresponds to extravagance. She makes this case by posing a two cultures conflict. This is quote number 5. Stirrings among young Asian Americans to break free from respectable, lucrative, but still necessitous service by abandoning traditionally safe fields like science, engineering, or medicine have become noticeable of late. The effort to, quote, kick the nerd syndrome, unquote, suggests that at least some segments of the community might have become educationally ready, ideologically willing, and materially able to take self-defining culture and community building to new levels of intensity. Acts of extravagance promise to undo some of the damage inflicted by the pressures, like racism, traditional culture, etc., against artistic production that have governed Asian American life for so long. So in this passage, Wong slyly maligns the post-1965 model minority when she lauds the effort to kick the nerd syndrome, which she characterizes with reference to science, engineering, and medicine, and with the suggestion that these nerds are somehow less capable of self-definition and what she calls acts of extravagance than those who would disavow them. So when it comes to our two cryptic sentences, Wong's solution is that they do not, in fact, evidence Maxine's capitulation to necessity and model minoritization, which is what a surface reading would suggest. Instead, she argues that these sentences are, in fact, Maxine's ironic take on what she believes her mother wants her to learn from Moon Orchid's ordeal. Indeed, the very next chapter reveals that At the Western Palace isn't narrated by a third-person omniscient narrator, which is how it reads, but is in fact Maxine's confabulated reconstruction of Moon Orchid's story based on a few remarks by her siblings. So it's therefore, the entire chapter is therefore an extravagant aesthetic production that testifies to Maxine's achievement of idealized critical subjecthood, rather than her relinquishing of it to necessity and model minoritization. So she's, at the end, not this model minority that seems to be claimed here, but an idealized critical subject. This is Wong's reading. So what I want to point out here is that this reading entirely elides the post-1965 historical specificity that science or mathematics, that phrase science or mathematics, introduces, that is, a narrative of selection. So instead, Wong's rush to align Maxine with extravagance and idealized critical subjecthood, in that rush, she reduces science or mathematics to mere symbols of necessity. Her argument thus reflects the logic of mutual exclusivity that is so fundamental to the overprivileging of the exclusion thesis, and that falsely opposes idealized critical subject and model minority in a contest of recognition. However, if we restore narratives of selection to these readings, and I'm swooping it here, then we find that the connection between the chapter's two final sentences is in fact overdetermined by post-1965 contradictions between gender identity, sexual relations, and professional identity. Clues to this begin to appear at the chapter's outset, which takes place at the San Francisco International Airport. There, Brave Orchid is waiting for Moon Orchid's arrival and their reunification after 30 years of separation. As the international arrivals stream in, Brave Orchid complains to her niece, Moon Orchid's daughter, whom she's brought along. She complains, this is number 6, sorry. These new immigrants had it easy. On Ellis Island, the people were thin after 40 days at sea and had no fancy luggage. Ellis Island had been made out of wood and iron. Here, everything was new plastic, the ghost trick to lure immigrants into feeling safe and spilling their secrets. Then the alien office could send them right back. Luggage conveyors fooled immigrants into thinking Gold Mountain was going to be easy. So we have here, in this quote, a juxtaposition of two very different immigration regimes. The easy plastic regime of the post-1965 era, that is the era of selection, and the exclusion period that preceded it, which is here emblematized by Ellis Island, as well as the material and physical price of risking immigration during the exclusion era. The chapter's depictions of separated husbands and wives, along with its central concern with reunification, can thus be read as articulations of the shift between exclusion and selection. One might therefore argue that this chapter is really about Maxine observing this shift playing out in the drama of her aunt's reunification with her husband. Indeed, both Moon Orchid and her doctor husband are in the US because of selection policies, though, as I've been stating, very different ones. So through various mechanisms, Brave Orchid secures Moon Orchid's immigration under the 1965 Act's family reunification framework. Moon Orchid's husband, however, immigrated sometime during the 1940s, that is during the exclusion period, and so was likely admitted as a desirable professional. The difference between these narratives of selection has consequences for gender identity and sexual relations. So Moon Orchid's contingent citizenship places her in what Susan Koshy calls a gendered relation of secondariness to her husband's professionally secured citizenship. In fact, because of her husband's new wife, we should probably say that Moon Orchid's gender and sexual identities are collapsed into a position of tertiariness, and that the best she can hope for from reunification is a relation of secondariness to her husband. Moon Orchid's reunification with her husband is not, therefore, only a matter of reconciling a non sequitur relation between the necessity of Chinese tradition and the extravagance of American sexual mores, or the necessity of marital union and the extravagance of adultery. Her reunification with her husband is also a matter of imaginatively reconciling the pre- and post-1965 Asian America. Therefore, necessity and extravagance aren't simply two poles of an immigrant consciousness whose tension is a transhistorical reflection of human instinct or cultural essence, which is what Wong is ultimately arguing. Instead, the tension between necessity and extravagance exists and is sustained only by material shifts in Asian American history. And so I would go even further, and to put a finer point on this, to argue that the coherence, the very coherence of the necessity-extravagance opposition in Wong's argument is borrowed from the two cultures' conflict that she dimly perceives, not the other way around. So again, Wong's reading is itself very post-1965 in how it analogizes the necessity-extravagance opposition with a contest between nerds and idealized critical subjects, and between the sciences and arts. So turning back to our two sentences, what selection tells us, what selection tells us is that we have to read them not only as evidence of Maxine's idealized critical subjecthood, but also as expressing a desire for the privileges of model minoritization. These sentences, which are routed through a two cultures form, articulate a rejection of the pre-1965 formation of Chinese culture that Maxine associates not only with adultery, but with the foreclosure of professional identity for Chinese women immigrants. By majoring in science or mathematics, Maxine and her sisters make a power grab in which they exercise control over their men's sexuality. Quote, they would never let men be unfaithful to them. They would never let them. So if science or mathematics describes the mechanisms through which this power is exercised, then at least two things are implied. One, that this power is exercised with the economic and social capital that accrue to a profession in science or mathematics. Or two, that science and mathematics, following Snow, actually names a post-war culture to which Maxine's and her sisters' men would likely belong, and that if Maxine and her sisters were assimilated to this culture, the risk of conflict and thus adultery might diminish. In other words, even if Maxine's idealized critical subjecthood affords her a degree of agency, that capacity is not mutually exclusive with her use of that agency to recapitulate a gendered and professional hierarchy. These sentences thus reveal the desire for model minoritization at the heart of the idealized critical subject, and then the potential for idealized critical subjecthood at the heart of the model minority. Okay, section 3. So turning now to native speaker, I want to make a case for how rebalancing exclusion and selection through the two cultures analytic might generate a response to Walter Ben Michaels' reading of Native Speaker as exemplary of Asian American fiction as neoliberal fiction. Michaels' critique is especially relevant to my argument because it uses a selection framework very much like the one I've developed in my talk today. His goal, however, is very different from mine. He aims to undermine the entire enterprise of Asian American studies and Asian American fiction as an object lesson demonstrating the mutual exclusivity of race and class analysis and the unimpeachable priority of the latter. There's much to be said here, but what I want to focus on is how Michaels' argument overprivileges selection in the same way that I've been critiquing Asian American criticism for overprivileging exclusion. So if Wong overlooks selection and overprivileges exclusion, then my critique of Michaels, who overlooks exclusion and overprivileges selection, fills the other half of my argument today. So the detail that Michaels wants us to focus on in the novel, which is about a Korean American character named Henry Park, who's a corporate spy working for a private intelligence agency in New York City, the detail he really wants us to focus on is that Henry grew up in an affluent neighborhood for part of his childhood. So Michaels argues, if Henry's wealth is a relevant fact about him, it is not the fact that the novel itself is most interested in. What the novel cares about is what it calls Henry's place in the culture, not his place in the economy, which means that we like the difference between black people and white people, or between whites and Asians, much more than we like the difference between the rich kids and the poor ones. More strongly, we might say that the novel's focus on identity functions not just to distract people from the increase in economic inequality, but to legitimate it. So according to Michaels, the Asian American novel should be singled out as a neoliberal literature because the model minority status of Asian Americans, Asian American writers especially, endows their literature with a maximum of depictions of identity and a minimum of depictions of economic inequality. In his reading of a moment in Native Speaker, when Henry imagines a rich old woman walking into his father's grocery store and declaring her identification with Koreans as what she calls Oriental Jews, Michaels goes on to argue that Asian American novelists in particular are obsessed with identity rather than economic inequality because they are members of a selected model minority class. That's quote number 8. They're members of a selected model minority class and have been beneficiaries of the official anti-racism of the last half century. So what makes the Koreans like the Jews is not their shared victimization, but their shared success. A success in which becoming like the rich old woman, which is to say rich, which prejudice like her own has been unable to prevent. The moral of the story is the importance of racism, the impotence of racism, not its power. Here, Michaels becomes the very boogeyman that proponents of the exclusion thesis most fear. That is, he argues that because the model minority is not a myth, but in fact an accurate depiction of Asian America as a whole, then racism is therefore impotent. But where my framework of selection is diametrically opposed to Michaels is in this framework's capacity to recognize that narratives of success are also narratives of racialization. So the post-1965 occupational segregation of Asian Americans is also racialization of Asian Americans as a professional managerial class with specific technical capabilities. And in its most extreme versions, as the math and science nerds who are perhaps genetically predisposed to techno-scientific genius. And this is something I go into more detail in my last chapter on Silicon Valley fiction and the sort of biological imagination of a nerd as a genetic future for humanity. The moral of Asian American success, in other words, is the insidious power of racism, not its impotence. Moreover, Michaels' overinvestment in economic class, as Henry's defining feature, fails to comprehend the geopolitical circumstances that the 1965 Act was in part designed to address, namely a global restructuring towards post-Fordist modes of labor in which economic class was being displaced by the professional managerial class as a relevant container for identity. In fact, Michaels' overprivileging of Henry's putative economic class leads him into an unforced error. His critique of Native Speaker, and by extension his critique of the Asian American novel and the novel of identity in general, American ethnic literature writ large, is based on his misreading of Henry's father's economic status before he emigrated to the US. Michaels assumes that Henry's father was upper middle class in Korea, and that after an awkward adjustment period in which he experienced some poverty, he eventually managed to reproduce his upper middle class status in the US and bestow it upon Henry so Henry could live in an affluent neighborhood. Michael's argument hinges almost entirely on Henry's father's putative affluence in Korea, because his point about post-1965 Asian Americans, again, is that their spectacular success at reproducing the economic class they occupied in their home countries evidences their complicity in economic inequality and the disingenuousness of their complaints about racism. But Henry's father was not rich in Korea. He was poor, and this fact makes all the difference. The reason Henry's father emigrates to the US is because his rural upbringing and poverty bar him from entry into what he calls the big network of Korean business in the 1960s, which was a period in which social class and family name mattered far more than economic class in regard to social mobility. Henry's father does indeed bring his class values with him to the US, but these are the values of his professional class, which are shaped by the two cultures' conflict. We learn that back in Korea, Henry's father earned a master's in industrial engineering at Korea's best university. After he immigrates to the States, he finds that his skills, that is, his professional identity, do not transfer. Unable to find suitable employment in the States, he quite resentfully becomes a grocer. This sudden fall in professional status rather than economic class is what leads him to encourage Henry to, quote, learn some Shakespeare words, so that Henry might avoid the difficulties that he faced. And note here that he says Shakespeare words and not English, thus referencing an aesthetic deployment of language rather than a purely pragmatic one, say. As it turns out, it's Henry's virtuosic facility with the English language that mediates the novel's anxieties over ethnic identity. So it's his professional identity that's bestowed upon him by his father that mediates this putative racial and ethnic identity between his Korean and American identities. And his virtuosic facility with the English language is also what forms the basis of his profession as a spy, which turns out to be nothing like James Bond's orgiastic techno-scientific melodrama, and much more like Shakespeare. So in addition to acting his part, what those in the biz call a legend, Henry's job entails writing extensive narrative profiles of his subjects. And what's important here is that Henry's supreme literariness, and thus his talent for his unique profession, is a direct consequence of his father's over-specialization in the sciences rather than the arts, as well as his father's subsequent immigration under the 1965 Act as a selected technical professional. And so what shapes Henry's psychology, more so than his father's putative economic class, are the professional values that his father attempts to bestow upon him through a modality of the two cultures. Along these lines, consider also that Henry is always described in proximity to the aesthetic. His wife, Lelia, is a poet. Lilia's friend Molly, that she stays with throughout the novel after she and Henry have fights. Lilia's friend Molly is a filmmaker and performance artist, and Henry meets Lelia at the apartment of Henry's college friend, who is a, quote, minor painter of landscapes. One might respond that the trope of the protagonist in agonistic relation with the aesthetic is as old as the novel itself, but what makes Henry and native speaker so distinctly post-1965 is how their relation to the aesthetic is mediated by a two cultures conflict. And in Henry's case, an edibly shaped two cultures conflict in which his father's thwarted engineering career sets him on a diametrically opposite path into the literary and performative arts. So if we restore the proportionality between narratives of exclusion and narratives of selection, then Native Speaker becomes a novel that, contra Michaels, is in fact keenly aware of inequality, as well as the insidious power of racism to operate through privilege and success. And so to offer a modification of Stuart Hall's oft-quoted formulation that race is a modality through which class is experienced, we might say that for occupationally segregated post-1965 Asian Americans, professional class is a modality through which race is experienced. So I'll end with the provocation that Woman Warrior and Native Speaker might be read as Asian American novels that are not concerned with Asian American racial or ethnic identity, or at least not primarily concerned with them. Instead, these novels are more concerned with thinking through a set of Asian American literary and social forms that aren't grounded in biology, traditional culture, or some other essentialism, but instead in the material forces producing and attending a historical shift from exclusion to selection. These novels, in other words, are concerned with how racial identity and material processes mutually determine each other and how that process informs literary character and genre. Women Warriors and Native Speakers' depictions of Asian Americanness as an articulation of the two cultures conflict thus brings them into an unexpected alignment with fiction by science fiction writers like Charles Yu and Ted Chiang, which I have chapters on each of those, which are strongly characterized by their avoidance of race and ethnicity, much less explicitly Asian or Asian American content. Woman warrior native speaker are thus paradigmatic of Asian American identity as a post-racial form, a form whose extravagance has, after 1965, outpaced its necessity as a strategic essentialism. Thank you.
Chris will call on a few points now.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll have a stab. This is just maybe to push you a little bit on your sense of what you need to rebalance. Because there's a way in which what you're describing are kind of the historical entailment of positions that, since at least the 19th century, have been important to kind of turf wars within the middle class, within the upper reaches of the middle class especially. So that one version of this story will be familiar to readers of Bourdieu, for whom there's this kind of battle for symbolic power within the upper reaches of the bourgeoisie between the kind of instrumentalist and the avant-garde. The avant-garde doubles down on aesthetic autonomy as being precisely not invested in outcome or money or kind of crass values important to the lower reaches of the middle class, and instead it's a kind of bid to attain kind of aristocratic pedigree. Going up to the 1960s, I mean, as C. Wright Mills was kind of always pointing out, there's a way in which the coalition that you invoke, professional managerial class, is itself a kind of, it itself gets torn asunder by some of the same problems that you point out, so that professionals are going to be the part of that class alliance that are forever pointing out their commitment to art or to these guild-based autonomous principles that are not instrumental, that are not involved in the making of money, they're not involved in managing others. And so the two cultures conflict is going to graft right there again, even within the group that you're describing as constituted by the principle of selection. And so that's just a big baggy question to ask you to speculate. I mean, I take the force that you want to restore some of the historical specificity between the tension between these two categories over against a kind of trans-historical one. But in between the trans-historical and the hyper-specific are these kind of long-standing problems within, the upper middle class that map loosely onto what you're describing.
Right. Okay. So my response is that I think what's uniquely going on here is the occupational segregation as a form of racialization, and it's the emphasis on racialization as something produced by the very material forces that you're talking about that I'm interested in. So that's the answer. But I mean, where I would like to situate this argument is precisely in this context that you're talking about, and just to sort of add on to your question about the things that I should be accounting for more. Is the emergence of the creative class, which I think further complicates these, the whole list of oppositions and analogous pairs that I had before. Engaging with, I think, discourse about immaterial labor and knowledge work and professional managerial technical class. All of these things I think are things that I need to sort of flesh out the situation in which this two cultures conflict and this occupational segregation is happening. But what I really believe is specifically happening to Asian America after 1965, just because the transformation has been not homogenous, but I mean very close to it, and because the racial forms that have been produced by the occupational segregation are so clear and I think so familiar to us, the Asian math and science nerd. I mean, I think that dimension of racialization is what makes it unique. But the last thing I'll say is that in terms of the contradictions within the professional managerial class, that's something that I have to sort out in post-1965 Asian America as well. There's this idea, for instance, of Barbara Ehrenreich's initial description of the professional managerial class. She says that there's a fundamental antagonism or mutual exclusivity between the profession, the PMC, and the working class, that their interests are diametrically opposed. And I think there's something to that in that logic of mutual exclusivity that I'm talking about, in that desire, for instance, for Lisa Lowe to proletarianize Asian America, that I still need to flesh out more. But I think the core of my argument is this occupational segregation. Yeah.
I have a sort of vague question about the extent to which, would you argue that the 1965 Act makes you actually surprisingly able to talk about immigrants from different parts of Asia as having a kind of common ground? I mean, at one point you mentioned Indian immigration, but kind of how do you see them relating to one another? Because I was interested in we've got China, we've got Korea here in the talk, so.
Right. Yeah. No. That's a really great question. I mean, the problem with Asian America is that it's this big naggy term that references a lot of different histories, most of which are contradictory histories of Japanese imperialism and colonization of Korea, and incursions into China, Chinese incursions into Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these histories don't play well together, and yet they're grouped under this term. And each of those groups has also been subjected to different exclusion and selection policies. So there are different histories. The 1965 Act did away with the national origins, even though there were policies of selection targeting Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants before policies of selection before 1965. But after 1965, national origins are thrown out the window, and the immigration proceeded along Cold War alliances, and so most of the immigrants coming over were from Korea and Taiwan, for instance. So Taiwan would send entire graduating classes of graduate students to United States graduate programs. And so, for instance, my dad was part of this wave of immigration, and I think a lot of the sort of Asian American intellectual class working today, their parents were part of this wave of migration as well. And I think and so sort of disambiguating those histories of selection in order to flesh out this two cultures thing. So but part of the problem here is that they're being racialized from the outside. And so Asians in general, are sort of stereotyped as math and science nerds, right? Regardless of whether they come from China or Japan or Korea or Vietnam. And that's the history that has to be that's the history that has to be sort of retold, I think, and recovered. So I don't think that disambiguating the national origins of these immigrants is as important as, I think, recovering these histories of selection and saying that they're there, right, and then applying them to specific contexts, like I applied, the specific context of Chinese immigration to the United States for Women Warrior, and then the specific situation of Korea's, economy that Henry's father was dealing with, and those circumstances that instigated his immigration, which exists not so much at the policy level, but at the economic and political level, right? So Henry's father didn't come to the United States because of U.S.-Korean relations necessarily, but because of his inability to access that big network of Korean business. Yeah, Rodrigo.
So I was really interested in your reading of the Walter Ben Michaels piece, which is really good and provocative in many ways. But one of my issues with that piece has been one of the issues you address, which is that it doesn't take account enough into ways that, whether it's identities or whatever, are being constructed in transnational formations, particularly. Like, it tends to be really kind of read these dynamics in a nationalist sense, right? So, but you're going back to Korea and bringing forward how the process of selection is itself being influenced by economic conditions even there. I mean, I think that addresses how, in this category at least, it's not necessarily just a national issue, it's a transnational one. Right. My question comes, what do we do with exclusion then? Is exclusion a U.S. formation? I mean, does that have transnational elements, or is that a U.S. creation? Is it mostly an academic or university-created kind of approach? So, so that's what I was wondering about.
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think for me, exclusion is more the name for a set of orthodox critical practices in Asian American studies than it is for the policies that they're attached to. So, you know, the sort of paradigmatic policy of exclusion would be the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And so, I mean, that's important to me, but what's more important to the argument, I think, is that that history of exclusion has sort of taken over and hijacked other modes of analysis and instituted forms of forgetting, I think, about things like policies of selection or histories of selection. So there are histories of exclusion, absolutely, that happen outside, in a transnational context, as you're saying. So for, you know, for instance, for Taiwanese occupational segregation, there's a sort of sorting process, and there's an entire history of United States CIA involvement, especially in Taiwanese universities and their selection of students and their cultivation of classes of engineers, for instance, that sort of precipitated and led to the immigration that I was talking about before. And so there is that history there, and that would be a history of exclusion and selection at the same time. But what's more important to me with exclusion is how it means that critical practice in Asian American studies. And so, yeah. So.
Yeah, one more just quick follow-up though. Would you associate exclusion more with a second generation wave in the sense, but I mean, you linked it to kind of, you know, academics or children of.
Right. I would associate selection far more with the second wave, and so, you know, and part of the reason, one of the reason that there was this explosion of Asian American literary and cultural production after 1986 or 1990 was because, you know, that's when they became old enough to write stuff. The children of these immigrants became old enough to write stuff and start publishing, you know, and so so the story of principles of selection is really the story of this class of post-1965 Asian Americans who were racialized along these very specific lines. Yeah.
I want to thank you for a really interesting and great talk. I have a couple of questions. One is actually just a clarification.
Sure.
Does this include H-1B visa holders? This chart that you have here on Asian immigration to the U.S.?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, because, you know, in thinking about H-1B, that is a very different kind of, when we're talking about immigration versus H-1B visa holders,
Right.
two very different things, right? So, and my question is about genre, because you talk about these works that are, I mean, we could argue about Kingston, whether it's memoir or, you know, literary fiction, right, as I call it. And then you're talking in your book about genres like science fiction or Silicon Valley, right? And so what is the significance of genre? And as I was listening to the talk, I couldn't help but also think of the proliferation of Asian American memoir post like 1990s, like, I mean, even things like Amy Chua or Kenji Yoshino or Eric Liu, right? These kinds of exemplary figures of the model minority, essentially, right? So just asking you to say a little bit more about the question of genre and how that fits into your argument. That would be great.
Excuse me. Okay, so for the first question, or the first comment about H-1B visas, that's right. That's a completely different economy than the immigration economy. And the H-1B visa it's a form of contingent labor, as I'm sure we're all aware. Most of these workers go into places that, you know, Silicon Valley, Silicon Alley, Silicon Beach,
Right.
and a lot of them. And there's an entire economy on the other side that identifies and selects and pushes them to companies. There's a pipeline. So, for instance, there are these things called body shops in India that take these technical professionals from India and then funnel them into American companies as cheap versions of technical workers. So it's another form of another form of coolie trade, I would say. So the H-1B visa, and I would say that and I think, I'm not sure if that graph combines them, but the graph is in the same shape in terms of the H-1B visa immigration, H-1B visa holders, and the post-1965 immigration, which is about, immigration of course is about citizenship status, and H-1B visa is purely work contingent, form of identity. So I would say the important thing about that is that the sort of optics of the companies in the context in which these H-1B visas and professionally selected Asian immigrants are in. So in a Silicon, let's say Google or something like that, the optics are still the same. And so this idea of the Asian American math and science nerd is still naturalized because of the sort of the alley-oop that the H-1B visa gives to these immigration selection policies. So that's one too. So in terms of the genre question, I think I haven't really thought much about the memoir and autobiography part. What I've been more concerned about is the explosion, because there is a lot of memoir and autobiography, but it's actually been numerically outpaced by the production of these other paraliterary genres. It's sort of astonishing how this has happened. I think young adult fiction is actually one of the hugest growth fields. In addition, of those three, science fiction, fantasy, and young adult fiction might be the hugest growth field. So it's really about bringing those into the fold, because memoir and autobiography have been in the main line of Asian American criticism and theorization, especially with Woman Warrior. And I feel like, and those have generally been read through a realist lens. And I think that, even sort of in contradiction with Asian Americanist critics' commitments to resist the ethnographic imperative, they're still read along those lines as well. And so what I'm trying to do is bring the nerds in, and see what they have to say.
Let me just to follow up on that and ask the genre question from the other direction. Because I'm curious then, and if you turn later in the project to write these modes of genre writing, is there a way that they put pressure not just on the conventional modes of Asian American writing, like the realism or the kind of memoir realism that we get in someone like Kingston or in January Lee, but on the very idea of the aesthetic, right, that is at stake in the kind of two cultures thing that you're tracking there. In other words, right, the Shakespeare's words thing, right, is kind of the kind of totally kind of canonized conventional idea of the aesthetic, and that's why we're kind of understanding kind of what it means to put genre fiction aside. So in turning to those works later, is there a way in which the very idea of the aesthetic, that's part of the kind of aesthetic sciences split, also sort of to get retheorized?
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Well, I think there were two parts to the question. So, in terms of how genre influences other sort of the DNA of Asian American literature, I think a good example of this would be Ruth Ozeki's new novel, Tale for the Time Being. It's not new anymore, but which is goes along the lines of memoir and autobiography. It's about a character named, it's this sort of metafictional novel about a character named Ruth, who lives in the exact same context as the real life Ruth Ozeki and is a writer, et cetera, and she discovers the diary of this other character, a Japanese teenager named Nao, who grew up in the United States, but after her father gets fired in Silicon Valley, they have to go back to Japan, and they're very poor there, and so she discovers Nao's diary after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. And so it's infused with a great deal of science fiction. And the novel, the science fictional element of the novel is used to suture together this sort of Pacific Rim imaginary that Ozeki is trying to evoke. And so I think that, and the two cultures context is just like going wild throughout this novel. And I think that what that's helping her to do is reimagine Asian and American geopolitical and climatological and ecological encounter in a way that's narratively available, right, and that's characterologically available. So I think the two cultures conflict and the sort of genre tension is now starting to redound back upon the Asian American, the idea of Asian American that's trying to be Asian American writers are trying to narrate and produce characters out of. So that's one thing. In terms of how the aesthetic is being re-theorized, that's a harder one. I mean, there are a lot of Asian American novels about artists, and I should just mention I'll mention the fiction of Charles Yu's fiction. I think does this a lot. You have a lot of frustrated scientists and a lot of frustrated artists, right? And and his solution, I think he's very keenly aware of these two cultures, of the two cultures dynamic. And you see in his fiction a continued desire to try to sublate the two cultures into a form that produces. So he often sort of transposes the two cultures conflict into intergenerational conflict. So the father is an engineer, the son has sort of artistic inclinations. And so sublating the two cultures is a way to achieve this kind of resolution of intergenerational conflict.
Yeah, yeah. And the sublation would look like science fiction.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Or even Taipei.
Taipei,
Which from a different point of view has a similar version of that fusion, because it's a kind of dispassionate and yet like almost hyper-scientific anatomizing moment-to-moment interaction, but it's consciously highlighted in fiction.
Yeah, I think also so Taipei is a novel by a writer named, Taiwanese American writer named Tao Lin, and it's the main character, Tao, is constantly on some sort of downer, right? And so he's constantly medicated. But I think also I would add to that, Tao Lin has often been described as deploying what people call autistic realism. And so he has this fascination with numbers, and so he'll say, like Chris paused for 4.76 seconds and then said something else. So he has this occupation with number, and I think there is another way in which he's and I think Tao Lin's actually really good response to Ted's question, because what Lin is trying to do in that novel, I think throughout his fiction, but in that novel especially, is to assert or create a sui generis version of the Asian American artist writer. And so there's this scene in the novel in which Tao and a friend are at the Asian American Writers Workshop. They're at a party, and they sit there and they mumble to each other, "I hate this place, I hate these people." And so it's this antagonistic relationship to a version of Asian American aesthetics that is sort of wrapped up in this institution of the Asian American Writers Workshop, for instance. So, but yeah, I mean, it's his version of the artist, his version of the aesthetic is autistic, and I think there's something to that that's very post-1965.
Any questions? If not, thank you so much.
That's what I asked you too.
I'm fine.